We are going way back on this because we're talking about the midterms here, and Abraham Lincoln had his own midterms back in the 1860s, and we're talking about the lessons of 1862 and how they may still apply to today's time. Now, at the worst moment of division and carnage in American history, we still had midterm elections to get through. Now, when President Joe Biden met last week with a select group of scholars for a Socratic dialogue about America's future, the esteemed historians compared the current crisis that we're facing in our democracy with two other historical periods: the years that immediately preceded the Civil War, which broke out shortly after Abraham Lincoln's victory in the 1860 presidential election, and the years before World War II, when the proto-fascist or explicitly fascist movements, like those that were led by aviator Charles Lindbergh, popped up all over the land. And yet, there is a third and closely related chapter of the American political history worth examining at this particular moment. The one that occurred not immediately before the Civil War, but during that conflict. And even during the worst carnage of the worst war in American history, elections were still being held, which is a remarkable accomplishment all on its own. Now, one of the two major parties of that period, the Democrats who dominated the South, were largely pro-slavery, or at best they were not opposed to it, but they were severely depleted because so many of them had joined the Confederate Rebellion. Now, the Republicans, a party that had only existed for a few years, held commanding majorities, but in a climate of intense partisan division. Now, this is uncomfortably similar to the United States that we see today. While a handful of Republicans have denounced Donald Trump's coup attempt, most are either sticking with the disgraced former squatter or trying to find some non-existent middle ground. So President Biden faces the question of how to deal with an oppositional party that seems ready to tolerate or even encourage actual violent rebellion when it loses their next election. So how did Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans of his era handle this situation? First, it's important to note that congressional elections were quite different 160 years ago at this particular time. Now, for one, they were scheduled in a manner that might seem bizarre to modern Americans, and that was especially true during the 1860 election, which was spread out over an extended period of time that included the secession of 11 southern states given the Republicans almost exclusively and Northern Party at that time. The overwhelming majorities in both depleted houses of Congress. In the Senate, Republicans held a 30-11 advantage, while the House had in the House they held 105 of the 149 seats. Now, for a party that was only formed back in 1854, this was an astonishing opportunity to transform America, and the Republicans seized on it. Now, going into the following midterms in 1862 and 1863, Lincoln's party faced intense public backlash for the Union's inability to end the war, the intense controversy around the Emancipation Proclamation Act, government policies that restricted free speech and civil liberties, and a range of economic issues, including inflation and taxes. Now, Republicans lost 22 seats in the House, but they still managed to hold on to effective control of that body and actually gained 3 more seats in the Senate. In other words, because the Democrats both literally and figuratively relinquished power during Lincoln's presidency, the Republicans had reaped political capital even during extremely adverse conditions, and they spent some of that capital on the history-changing project of ending chattel slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation Act didn't actually do just that, but it certainly started the process, and it also pursued a wide range of economic programs that appear remarkably progressive, even by modern standards. Now, creating the Department of Agriculture, funding the Transcontinental Railroad, reforming monetary policy, and creating the first national parks and land-grant colleges. Now, one policy, the Homestead Act, it made millions of acres of government-held land available at every low cost, and for good measure, Lincoln made Thanksgiving an international holiday for the first time. Now, his vision of the Union meant opportunity for all. Hence, the homestead acreage for the many. Now, the Lincoln historian Harold Holzer basically told Salon about the 1862 Homestead Act during an interview last year, and it meant encouraging the farming over hunting, independent farming to replace plantation aristocracies, hence creating the Agriculture Department. Now, just as important as this, most Republicans understood it was essential to hold the Confederate traitors accountable. Now, even though the Republicans are traitors now, despite critics from moderate Republicans and Northern Democrats, Abraham Lincoln wanted to make sure that prominent Confederates would be barred from political office in the future, and he was inclined to be lenient with rank-and-file rebel soldiers, while the so-called radical Republicans favored a more punitive policy. but no one doubted there had to be consequences for people who took up arms against the government because they were unhappy about losing their election. Now, this brings us back to the present time, and the historic passage of the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which might not match the grandeur of Biden's original Build Back Better agenda, but it still counts as the landmark achievement of his term and one of the biggest pieces of policy legislation in decades. Now, Biden has had other achievements as well as a number of obvious setbacks, but it would be ludicrous to suggest he comes anywhere near Lincoln's legacy. Now, arguably, he does face a similar problem in deciding how far to go in pursuing and prosecuting Donald Trump and his sycophantic inbreds of the Trump insurgency. Now, whether or not Biden truly holds Trump and his enablers accountable is likely to determine how history views his presidency. Now, if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just as little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way, and thanks for listening.